take notes and keep those. We're still in this faith series, Giants of the Faith series. And today, in sequence, as they're listed or spoken of in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be looking at Moses, the deliverer of Israel. He's one of the most revered heroes of faith in the Old Testament and best known around the world. I would think probably Abraham and Moses are probably two best among all the different religions of the world. You know, other religions, even though they're not Christian, have a connection back to the ancient Hebrews, and they claim them, like all the Jews. They claim them. And even on Abraham, the Muslims claim him. So, because there's connections genetically and genealogically to that. But today we're going to be looking and learning some key lessons about faith from the life of Moses. And so let's just read this passage together. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. Because, in context, Pharaoh had issued a decree and an edict that all babies under 2 years of age were to be killed, whether by sword or thrown out into the Nile River to drown, because he thought the Hebrews were getting too prolific and too big. And he wanted to kind of talk about population control. That's what he was about. So, but they, by faith, hid him because he was a gift from God. They saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. In spite of that edict, they were going to do what was right before God. All right? And by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, he made a choice. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter because he was taken into that family. You know the story. Choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ, or the Messiah, greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. He had all the wealth of Egypt at his disposal as the adopted son of the Pharaoh. He was living in palaces with all the wealth and luxury of that, and he chose to reject all that and identify with his people who were slaves. So that's quite a choice. For he was looking to the reward. What reward? The reward of the blessing of doing what God said was right and hearing, well done, my good and faithful servant. Anyhow, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was unseen, the Lord. By faith he kept the Passover when he came back to deliver the people, the first Passover, and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. And then by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land. And they were. And the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the exact same thing, were drowned. And so this is a great passage about the faith, and we'll look at other details in the book of Genesis and Exodus about that too. But the name Moses means, you know what it actually means? To be drawn out, to be extracted. And that was the name given him by Pharaoh's daughter, because he was drawn out or extracted from that little ark made of bulrushes in the Nile River. Because Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the Nile. Moses' life is divided into 3 great periods, 40 years each. First 40 years of training, second 40 years in testing, and the final 40 years of service, extraordinary service to the Lord. And you'll find this pattern played out in many lives. There's the 3 periods, if you will: training, testing, preparing you. And if I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we're in good company here, most of us here. The final third of many, many Bible characters' lives were their most fruitful and productive, not the first and second. In other words, you have greater opportunity, greater wisdom, greater experience, and you're able to accomplish more for the Lord now at this stage in your life than you could in your earlier years. So don't think, well, I'm retired, I'm over and done. No. You now have more time, freedom, flexibility to serve the Lord and accomplish His purpose for your life now than you did 30, 40, 50 years ago. What happened here? Yeah.
How old was Moses? Because if it's got 3 sets of 40 years, that makes 120.
He died on his birthday, 120.
Okay. So it was broken up into...
Yeah. Not that it was necessarily tied to his exact birth date, But there were 40-year periods, and it turned out to be that way. 40-year periods. All right, so for 40 years, he was trained. Here's a verse that supports that in Acts. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. In other words, he got a summa cum laude graduate degree in the educational system of Egypt, being an adopted son of the Pharaoh. In other words, in today's terminology in America, he would go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, somewhere like that, and gotten that level of education. But also, it was 40 years he was tested also. And that 40 years he spent out in the wilderness, the desert, and found his wife and married. And you know what? He was kind of happy where he was. He was doing okay. Okay. It says Moses fled, became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons, married, had 2 kids. And after 40 years had passed, an angel, really the angel of the Lord, appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning thorn bush. You know the burning bush? He was doing fine until that burning bush happened. And God redirected his life. For this Moses, whom they disowned, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" is the one whom God sent to be both ruler and deliverer with the help of the angel. Moses didn't do that on his own. Who was with him? Who anointed him? Who protected him? Who energized him? It was the Lord who appeared to him in the thorn bush. And so he was tested during that time to find out if he was going to follow and trust the Lord, because the Lord is your strength, the Lord is your provision, the Lord is the only one that could accomplish what needed to happen. And then 40 years he faithfully served God, doing what he was trained to do. Look at these verses. This man, Moses, led them out of Egypt, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt. He was the one God used. Well, who was performing those wonders and signs? The angel of the Lord. And in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. And God was with him. He inquired of the Lord. He used him to give the 10 Commandments, the law of God. I mean, all kinds of stuff. He was mightily used of God. But Moses' life is not a lot different than ours, in the sense that God takes us through periods and seasons in our life in our fulfilling his purpose for our life. Periods of training, testing, and service in the life of every believer. So I want us to look at these three 40-year periods of Moses in Hebrews 11. First 40 years, faith by inheritance. Second 40 years, faith by choice. And the third 40 years, faith by experience. So let's look, first of all, at the faith by inheritance, okay? Faith by inheritance. Now, let me clarify that. It says here, by faith, Moses, when he was born into a godly Jewish family, okay, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, special, beautiful gift from God. They knew he had a special purpose. They were not afraid of the king's edict. Now let's make sure we clarify something here. When we talk about faith by inheritance, we don't mean that Moses somehow became a believer and was born again, as we use the phrase today, just because his parents were. No. He inherited his faith, the training, the discipline. They taught him the scriptures. They taught him all the things he needed to know. But he had to personally embrace that. You see, I learned a long time ago, God has no grandchildren, only children. You have to have a personal relationship with him. The fact that your parents were godly Christians doesn't mean you are. You have to personally receive it yourself. That's why John 1:12 says, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the sons of God." You don't become a Christian just because your daddy was a preacher and your mom was a godly Sunday school teacher. It doesn't happen that way. You have to personally receive it and embrace it for yourself. The scriptures abound with examples of parents of faith having great and godly influence on their children, though, and his parents did. They influenced him. They taught and trained him that way. That doesn't guarantee they'll embrace it, follow it, and obey it. We also give examples of kids who came out of families and homes like that, who turned their back on it and ran away. Amram, and Jochebed was his mother. They weren't any special in the line of anything. They were just two, kind of like Mary and Joseph. Okay? They were average Jewish people that God chose for his purposes. It was a God's choice. Yeah.
I don't understand something right here. It says that they knew he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. The king's edict was to kill all the baby boys. So they were afraid, so they hid him.
No, they weren't afraid. They didn't do what he wanted. They, as Scripture teaches, you're to obey the authorities and so forth unless they command you to do something expressly forbidden by God, and then you have to do what God says and be willing to suffer the consequences. Kind of like Daniel and his 3 friends.
But that doesn't mean that, it seems to me that, well, anyway, it says they were not afraid, but to me, afraid would be to hide your child in the water.
No, that showed their faith. They weren't afraid to go against the edict that he made because it was against God's law and commands.
And this is where I do think his sister Miriam's story is so sweet.
It is.
That impressed me.
You'll see not only did he have God's protection, but he had God providentially, God's provision. Only God could work out a situation where not only was he protected from the dangers of the Nile in that little boat she made, bobbing around out there, and he happened to drift up into the bulrushes right where Pharaoh's daughter was coming down. And then she just happened to see him and had favor on him when she could have said, one of these Hebrew kids, throw him in the river. No, she didn't. And then Miriam's sitting there and she said, oh, look at this little baby. She said, I know. You want me to get a nurse to help take care of him for you? And then goes out and gets her mother and his mother. Only God can do that. Think about that. She got to nurse and take care of her own kid with the protection and provision of the palace of Pharaoh. Yeah.
I see what Alice is saying, because all our Sunday school years, we've heard that they were afraid, so they hid him in the basket.
Well, they are afraid if they found him, he would kill him, sure.
But I think what you said, I circled that when I said, well, that's different. They're not afraid of the king's edict. I think the consequences of them hiding, they weren't
They weren't afraid to do the right thing in spite of the king's edict.
Right. Yeah. I mean, who would want to protect their baby?
Kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't afraid. They stood up. They said, we'll honor the king, but we cannot do this. We will not bow down and worship you.
I mean, this is scripture, so I'm not going to argue with it.
Good. You can't live in a preacher's home and argue with scripture. You can't do that.
If it was my baby, I'd be afraid. But they weren't afraid to obey the Lord.
Well, they had a proper fear of that. They respected the fact that if he was found, they would kill him. So they were protecting and hiding. They weren't.
They weren't afraid of the king's commandment. They weren't afraid.
Right.
It was an absolute edict in the land.
That's kind of hit me when I read that.
And Pharaoh's edict was the law of the land. Okay, and they weren't afraid of that. They weren't afraid of violating it or going against it because they were going to honor God rather than him. There are other. Well, same thing. When Herod said kill all the babies, and they took off to Egypt to protect him, they didn't. They weren't going to let that dictate what they would do. Also in the Old Testament, Hannah, Samuel's mother, she prayed for a child and said, if you give me a child, I will give him to you and dedicate him to you and all that. That showed what a great influence they had. And she gave that child to Eli in the temple. And she would visit him. But God blessed her with a child, and she gave it back to God and gave Samuel to serve in the temple. Also Elizabeth, very godly woman. And Zacharias, the father to whom John the Baptist was born. And notice, talking about their character, both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. They were as good a consecrated Jewish couple, believing couple, as you'll find. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well along in years. And yet, they dedicated their son. When the moment they knew she had conceived, they dedicated him to God. And by faith, their faith had a dramatic impact on the life of John the Baptist. You talk about somebody who wasn't afraid of the king's edicts, and he stood up and he preached boldly and proclaimed You see, that's the same type of fear they had. Oh, they feared and respected his authority, what he could do. And by the way, that same authority eventually had enough of him and they executed him, right? But he was willing to do that because his purpose was to represent God and not worry about the commands of the authorities, which were against God. Okay? He didn't go out and say, I'm a rebellion, I'm going to lead a revolt. No. He just said, I'm going to do what God said. And if it was unpopular or would bring about my death, so be it. By the way, Jesus did the will of the Father, even though the Jewish leaders hated him and they crucified him. But he didn't let it thwart what his purpose and plan was. You see, we live according to the purpose and plan of God. When it goes against various obstacles, including the authority and even the execution power of kings or nobles or other governments, they don't let that stop them from carrying out the purposes of God, because who's the highest authority? God. And he tells us to obey the other authorities, whether they're Christian or not, unless they command you to do something that is expressly forbidden by God. Would like Daniel and his 3 friends are a good example of that. Okay? And they said, sorry, O king, you can do what you want to do, but we will not bow and worship you and violate the commandment of God. And they knew that fiery pit was over there and they were going to be thrown into it. But for God's purposes and his glory, he delivered them from that. And the testimony of that caused even the king to say, from this day forward, nobody badmouths their God. He's powerful. Okay? Now, you read Fox's Book of Martyrs in the early church, but there were a lot of other believers just as devout, and God did allow them to suffer execution or martyrdom or whatever. And by the way, through their martyrdom, the impact was so great that many hundreds and thousands more people followed Christ because of that. You know? I mean, look at little Charlie Kirk effect. Look what this had in this country. Same thing happened in the early church when Stephen stood there and his face glowed like the face of an angel as they were stoning him to death to the glory of God. Guess who was standing over in the corner going, what is with these people? Saul of Tarsus. You don't think that had an impact? He'd probably go, what in the, I don't get these people. Although he was committed to getting rid of them until he met a greater light. Mm-hmm. Boom. He who had been the greatest enemy of the cross and believers now became its most vocal and effective advocate. And then the Jews wanted to kill him. You know? Okay. So this is the same pattern that they had. Oh, they respected and feared what could happen, but they weren't going to let that stop them from fearing God and fulfilling. God gave us Moses. We're going to protect him and do everything we can to make sure he fulfills the purpose God has for him here, even if it costs us our life. Okay, that's the kind of fear that they had here. Those are all good questions. A more recent example historically, Susanna Wesley, mother of John and Charles Wesley. She had 14 kids. You think you had it rough, 14 kids. All of which she raised to know, love, and serve Christ. And John and Charles were standouts. John was the great missionary evangelist, founded and led what became the Methodist Church back in the day because of his organized methodologies, Methodism. And Charles wrote lots of hymns and songs that we sing to this day. Okay? She trained them to follow the Lord, but they had to embrace it for themselves. And God used them. So notice 3 things that are true of Moses' parents in verse 23. His parents risked their lives out of love for Moses. When he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. What would happen if Pharaoh's drudgeons discovered that there was a baby, Moses, in that household? What would they have done to Moses? Killed him. And they also took out a certain degree of wrath on the parents who were obstructing the justice of Pharaoh. They could have been killed. Well, sake of time, I don't want to read this whole passage. This is telling the whole story about Moses. And, she hid him in a papyrus little ark and so forth, placed him in the river. Then his sister stood a distance to see what would happen. And Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. Just so happened, right? The providence of God just so happened.
No coincidence.
She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her little slave girl to get it. And she opened it and saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. And this is one of the Hebrew babies, which were under the condemnation and curse of Pharaoh, her daddy. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter. She was standing over in the reeds watching. She ran up and said, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you?" "Yes, go." That was a God thing. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. How you like that? Jochebed. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "All right, now she has the command of Pharaoh's daughter, not to get rid of him, but to protect him, provide for him. Take this baby, nurse him for me, and I will pay you." She got paid to take care of her own baby. That's a God thing, right? Okay. When the child grew older, though, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. He was the adopted son. And she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." That's quite a story. It shows the purpose and plan of God will not be thwarted. But he does it in such a way when everybody participates, they do what they want to do. And when they do that, they're doing the will of God. Like Pharaoh, the later Pharaoh, when he opposed Moses, he was hard-hearted, this, that, and the other. He did everything he wanted to do, not realizing as he was doing all those things, he was doing the will of God. Talk about the sovereignty of God. Well, so parents, this teaches us that our responsibility is to love our children enough to live for them. Live for them, teach, train, and develop them. What an influence they had on his life. You must also love them enough to train them properly, not just let other people do that. Be careful about who all you have influencing your kids, which is why so many parents either put their kids in Christian schools to get out of that vain philosophy of the world, or they homeschool because they take this very seriously. Now, it's not that you're a sinner if you don't, but you have a lot of work cut out for you. If they're in the public school system, you have to be constantly aware of what's going on. You have to offset that. You have to teach and train so we know that's not true. Any one of those systems can work, but your commitment to teaching, training, and develop them is all got to be equal, whatever it takes. Okay?
John?
Yeah.
Sadly, many families that have children that are raised Christian and are active in church and believers go to college. And many of our universities teach that you hate the country, hate God, hate authority, and rebel. And that's what we're living with in places like New York right now. There
And a
are
lot
so
of other
many
places.
ignorant, educated people in this country. And we're seeing some very scary things going on. And Tuesday is we should pray for the city of New York that people with sense will come out and vote against the communists.
Well, that's why we would certainly pray, although they may get what they deserve.
Well, they don't deserve it because if they win New York, the next will be Los Angeles, and next will be Portland. There is no stopping the plan, and it's just
God, well, Charlie Kirk's situation, God did a lot of redirecting there in his purposes. I'm not saying what will happen. This also says, many parents think, well, I've done my job, gone through high school, send them off to some of these colleges thinking, oh, I'm sure they know what's going on. They have never faced what they're going to face on the college campuses. And you better teach and train and prepare them for that too, if they're going to a secular school or university, because they're going to get all garbage. Okay, that's why many parents still send them at least to a Christian university where they can get the education, but at least the philosophy there is biblical. That's why I went. Bunny, we both went to where I got as good an education academically as anywhere else, but it was done in the context of a biblical worldview. That's so important. Well, that's another whole topic, but that's what we got here. It's anyhow. Look what it says here. In training your kids, fathers, do not make your children angry, but raise them with the training and teaching of the Lord. That's the key. You got to spend a lot of time with your kids, letting them see that God, Jesus, He's the way, the truth, and the life. It's practical. It's real. It works in this world. It's not just pie in the sky. You got to hold them accountable. His parents believed that God had a purpose for his life. How do we know that? Well, it says they saw that he was a beautiful child. That don't mean he was just cute. It means he was beautiful. He was beautifully provided, given by God. It doesn't just mean his looks. They saw that he was a special gift from God. And it says in Acts, it backs that up. It says Moses was born and he was lovely in the sight of what? That gives clarity to what they meant by beautiful child in the Old Testament. We just, oh, and he's so cute. It was more than that. This clarifies and gives insight. Beautiful, lovely in the sight of God. It's his special creation for a special purpose. And that's, by the way, that's why we value life so much. Beth knows about that. Had a whole ministry because they believe in the value of life and keeping mothers in this culture from doing what the world says, sacrifice your children on the altar of expediency and secularism. And actually, it's an act of worship, but it's not to God. It says here also, they were not afraid of the king's edict. They did what was right regardless. We value life and are opposed to abortion. But whether a child is conceived in a loving act or a sinful one, do you know it doesn't matter? That life is still specially created by God for his purposes. We tend to think in a secular mindset, oh, well, if that baby was conceived under abuse or rape or anything else, then maybe it should be aborted. Why? Maybe it didn't do anything wrong. You see, there are no illegitimate children, only illegitimate parents. You see? The baby shouldn't be punished because of the sinful, illegitimate acts or deeds of a parent or sperm donors or whatever you want to call them. That child is still specially formed in the image of God, and God has a purpose for them. And that's why we believe every life is valuable, especially by God. They're not illegitimate. Their circumstances may have been, but they are not. Okay, so we also see that Moses, he had faith by choice. Now, he didn't just go along with it because his parents did. How many kids say, well, that's just the way I was raised? Well, if it's only the way you was raised, when you get out on your own, you'll chuck it when the pressures of the world hit. If it's not genuine and real with you, I would tell you as a youth pastor, you say to parents, don't assume anything. Don't assume that because you loved them, took them to church, they were there every time the church doors open, went to camp, did everything else. Automatically, that means they're going to do the right thing, go the right. I don't know how many young people, you've heard of them too, that were model children the whole time they were growing up. Nobody suspects. They go off to a college or university, and when they're a year or two, maybe 3, they say, I don't believe that stuff no more. You know why they can say that? Because they never received it. They conformed to the culture. They conformed to what their parents said. They conformed to what was expected at church. They conformed. They are master conformists, but they're not believers. You know the ultimate example of that? Jesus chose how many disciples? One was a devil from the beginning. 3.5 years went with Jesus everywhere, did everything that other disciples did. They saw everything, heard everything. Actually got up and spoke things that he knew were expected and correct. But his motives were different. His intents were different. And when the test came, he revealed what was really in his heart. And he betrayed Jesus, sold him for 30 pieces of silver, betrayed him. And then later the commentary of Scripture, not the opinion of men, is he was a devil from the beginning, which he never embraced Jesus as Savior and Lord. He conformed to the system, but his expectations was Jesus was going to lead a revolution to get rid of the Romans and free the Jews, the Zionists. And when he saw that Jesus wasn't about that, he goes, pfft. Now, that happens, Christian kids raised in Christian families too. So there's no guarantees. You know, Jesus was, I would think we would call him the model mentor. And one of them didn't embrace it. You can be great model parents and one or more of your kids cannot embrace it. Break your heart. But they've got to embrace it. You can't make that happen, can you? You can pray that they will do it by the grace of God. Well, Moses by choice. You know, I thought for sure I was going to get all three of these points in today. But Avis's question blew me right out of the water. I don't know. No, I'm gonna do this one verse, and then, as often happens, which I like it this way, you know that. My focus is on teaching the content and the truth and allowing questions and interaction. I don't care if we got only one page. We can pick it up next week and keep going, because what's our purpose? Get rid of this lesson that's in the quarterly. We got to get to the next no matter what? No. The reason I'm doing this, not using quarterlies, I want us to focus on truth and content and so forth, and take as long as it takes for us to cover that, answer questions, for you to be able to understand it, make it clear. You can understand it. Embrace it and let it transform your life. But we'll do this one verse here. By faith, to prove it was a choice, and we'll pick up here next week. Moses, when he had grown up, by the way, where did he grow up? In Pharaoh's palace, right? He was surrounded by all the paganism, the materialism, and authoritarianism that went with Pharaoh's household, and all that false worship, and all that stuff. And yet, who was right there teaching him and training him? That's not right. That's not right. In reading the scriptures, we serve. Who was teaching and training him? So he grew up in that culture. When the time came, he showed where his faith was. Moses didn't just conform, he was transformed. Okay? He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of life. Imagine if you had at your disposal the ability to live in the most luxurious accommodations in the whole world. He had a lot of power and authority, being one of Pharaoh's sons, and influence. Nobody would dare cross him. And he had all of that. The wealth, the power, the prestige, everything that went with being a son of Pharaoh. But he saw his people, God's people, as slaves being abused and tormented and persecuted. And he chose to stand with them, not stay under the auspices of the Pharaoh, enjoying the passing pleasures of sin and all that that lifestyle brought, considering the reproach of Christ. Now, Christos is the Greek word for the anointed one, the Messiah, the promised Messiah. And by the way, Jewish faith was all rooted by faith in the Messiah and what he was going to do when he came. We're trusting in the Messiah who did come and accomplish what we know he did on the cross. But they were saved exactly the same way, by faith in what the Messiah was going to do, just like we're saved by faith in what the Messiah did 2,000 years ago. Salvation was no different. By faith, yes.
After the born again experience, we are really aliens from another world, from heaven.
That's right.
And we're in the world, but not of the world. So
That's right.
We've got to keep reminding ourselves, because the
We do.
world can come at you big time.
That's why we have a church. He made a church so we get together, other believers, and encourage one another. Exactly right. He considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than all the treasures of Egypt. And that was worth billions and billions in the day's economy, trillions, if you will. This was the most powerful empire on the earth at that time. For he was looking to the what? I care about the pleasure and favor of God more than I do the pleasures of Egypt and the favor of Pharaoh. That's what his character was. It was tested for 40 years in the wilderness. And when God was ready at the burning bush, he said, all right, it's time. The reason you're here on the earth is to fulfill my purpose. It's time. I'm kind of happy out here. Use my brother Aaron. He talks good. It's time. I chose you. You're going to go. You're going to do it. And I'm going to be with you. You know, all you need is the promise that God will be with you. That's all you need. If you'll trust in him, there's nothing you can't accomplish in his name. Nothing. Because it's really not us, is it? It's him. He's using us. His power flows through us. His message is given through us. But we're here to be his messengers in this world. That's what Moses was. And how mightily did God use him? But he had to be obedient and submissive to God's call, which he did at the burning bush. We'll pick up there next time. By the way, in the burning bush, what did he immediately do? The bush is burning and it's not being consumed. This is unusual fire. And then when the Spirit of God starts talking to him out of it, okay, and he hit the ground. Worship. Took his shoes off. Because he knew who was talking to him. Same thing happened on Mount Sinai later. By the way, same thing happened to Saul of Tarsus. See? How about you? You had an encounter with the Lord like that? When he speaks, do you hit the ground? Yes, Lord. Whatever you want, that's me. Even Jesus in the garden, in his humanity, said, Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me. I know what's coming, and it ain't pretty. Nevertheless, not my will. Yours be done.